Good afternoon. I just have to be sure everything is working. Welcome to Shandon United Methodist Church and to our hosts who is the United Methodist Church here in South Carolina. My name is Jonathan Holston. I serve as the resident bishop here in South Carolina. As a part also of the South Carolina bishops, known in a past lifetime as Larkham, but because we are now a part of a new group which has included our Pan-Methodist brothers and sisters in South Carolina, we are gratefully changed our name so that we can be inclusive of all who are in our state who represent us in this work together. So welcome to Shandon United Methodist Church. Welcome to the South Carolina Annual Conference on behalf of the United Methodist Church. And welcome to this time of conversation and dialogue. Will you join me in prayer? Gracious God, we are grateful for this time that we share together. We pray that you will allow us to be the people that we need to be and to be in conversation with one another. Help us to dialogue, not just in conversation only, but also in deciding how we go and what we do. Help us to be the doers of the word, not just the hearers. And if we do so, my Father, we'll give you all the praise and glory. For this we ask in your name and pray. Amen. I've been asked to share a scripture to kind of order our time today as we share with Dr. Hart, who will begin to lead our discussion, and I will share with you and invite other bishops who represent our organization here today. But what I really wanted to do was to take a scripture from Romans 12 and to look at it and to let you hear it as we go forward and to help us to understand that education is important for all of our young people. Everyone, whether it's a public education or a private school education, all of our children deserve an education. But we recognize also that there are hurdles that we have in the midst of our community and our society that we have to acknowledge, we have to deal with. And this is one of those conversations that we have today. So here, Romans 12, beginning at verse 9, hear these words and hear what Paul says to us today. Let love be genuine. Hate what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not lag in zeal and be ardent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in suffering. Persevere in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints. Extend hospitality to strangers. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. And beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine. So if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink. By doing this, you will heap burning coals on their heads. And my friends, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. At this time, I'd like to invite Bishop Herman Yost to come and to share and order furthermore our day together. Bishop Yost.
Good afternoon. We were meeting last March, I believe, in the Fellowship of South Carolina Bishops and talking about education and advocacy for all the children of our states. And the issue of race and racism came up, and all of us said, yeah, we're trying to work on that together, but we realize that it's one of the big things that divides up our school systems that affects all of our children. And I brought up there that I had just been in a book study group with about half African Americans and half Caucasian pastors on the book, The Trouble I've Seen, Changing the Way the Church Views Racism. I said, wouldn't it be great if we could get Dr. Drew Hart to come and speak to us? And the rest of the group said, well, it may be great, but we'll trust your judgment, Herman. And I said, look it up, look him up. And when they did, every one of them said, this sounds like an outstanding opportunity. I've never met Dr. Hart before today. I've had several conversations with him on the phone. But having read this book, I feel like I know a part of his journey. And his journey is one that I think is familiar to many of us. And I think he's going to have a lot to teach us and a lot to share. In the back of the room, on the table that you signed in at, there's there's a white sheet of paper. If any of you want to become a part of an ecumenical, interracial book study using this book, following up on this conversation, sign up, put your email and your address and your phone number down, and we'll organize some groups and do this. Our group met in each other's homes. We took turns and we had a cover dish meal. We'd cover 2 chapters at a time, and it was a powerful experience. It was a way of deepening the conversation, which I think needs to happen around the state. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Hart. He's a theologian, activist, blogger, and assistant professor at Messiah College. He received his PhD in theology and ethics from Lutheran Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. His blog, Taking Jesus Seriously, is hosted by Christian Century, and he speaks regularly at churches, university, conference, and seminaries. He and his wife, Renee, have 2 young sons, Micah and Dietrich. Dr. Hart, it's a pleasure and joy to welcome you to Columbia, South Carolina. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that introduction. And one correction, actually, since that bio, we actually have a 3rd son now, Vincent. Vincent is named after, some of you are familiar with Vincent Harding, friend of Dr. King, and passed away a couple years ago, but I had the opportunity of being influenced by him personally, and so we named our 3rd son after him. I'm grateful for the opportunity again to just be here and to have these important conversations. Certainly now more than any other time, though I feel like we're always saying that it's critical for us to be having these conversations in the church. And so I want to not belabor and just get moving because I know we have a limited amount of time to engage together. But just as an overview of what we're going to try to do, the first section that we're going to do is going to be just changing the way the church views racism, thinking about our frameworks for race, systematically thinking about what that means for us. And included in that will be trying to think about what that means for public education as well. Our second and third parts, the second part is going to be thinking about what is whiteness? What does that even mean? What do we mean by that? White supremacy, all these terms that we throw around, and thinking historically about their developments. And then the last section will be contextualizing blackness, thinking about what that means for us as well. So anyway, that's what we're going to do. So you can go on to the next slide. So I have a friend, Todd Allen. He's a new colleague of ours at Messiah College. He has for years done civil rights bus tours, taken groups, usually I guess from the north, but taking them down through the south to all the different hot spots and getting them to really understand the story of what the civil rights movement was all about in that freedom struggle. Because of that work, he tends to also frequently speak in a variety of churches. In fact, there was this one particular church not far from campus where we live that I spoke at in the previous January, and then he recently spoke at this summer. Well, there he was at this church, and he's getting ready to get up to speak. They showed, there were some of the participants of his civil rights bus tour that were in the congregation, and so they just had shown like one of those videos, you know, with the music's playing. It's really emotional, and it's kind of touching. You see all the different sights. And right after that finishes, and he's right about to get up, someone, an older white gentleman, yells out, "Why won't y'all just get over it?" Of course, for him, it was such an awkward moment to have to kind of be getting ready to speak, and that's the kind of environment that you're going to be entering into. I thought about that response, this idea, just get over it, that, I mean, we've all heard it at different points, very prevalent. And I kind of sometimes, I'm kind of strange. I like when people say kind of silly things that they haven't thought through. I like to be in dialogue with those folks because it only takes like a step beyond that to realize the gaps in the thinking. And so I thought about what I might have said had I been the one getting up afterwards and someone had yelled, "Get over it." And I thought about the fact that I would want to ask him, when were you ever on it to begin with? You know, like, did you come from have you lived a full life of anti-racism and struggled? Do you come from a long legacy of folks who've been fighting for racial justice, maybe civil rights leaders, and maybe going back abolitionists? Have you really been a part of this long legacy, this freedom struggle for justice, that you've been on it to begin with, or have you never been on it at all? And so I imagine that, a lot of folks who often say, "Get over it," in fact, have never been on it to begin with. And I think that demonstrates some of the challenges that we have, right, when we're thinking about these really huge, not only present struggles, but historic realities that shape our present world, that for so long, especially in the church, we have avoided giving the full attention that we need to give it. And so my encouragement is, instead of getting over it, how about for the first time we all decide as a whole church, right, that we're going to get on it together, get on it and do the work of justice, do the work of speaking truthfully, do the work of righteousness and peace. Next slide. Anytime that we have really serious conversations on race and racism, one of the challenges is that it can be really challenging and awkward for some folks to listen to and respond to, particularly if you haven't been raised in a context where race and racism have been normal conversations around the dinner table in your family, in your churches, in your community. And so some sociologists and psychologists and other very smart folks have come up with terms, and one of the terms that they came up with is a term called white fragility. And what this term was trying to do and describe was the ways in which sometimes white people have been formed and socialized to not have conversations around race. And for those that particularly really have gone quite a while not having substantial, meaningful conversations on race, the kind of defensiveness that can come, right? The kind of shutting down, the wanting to leave conversation rather than say and persevere through the conversation. And so I bring this up only because I can't keep track of anybody else's emotions or how they're responding, but I can keep you accountable to your own emotions and how you're responding, right? And so I just ask simply that if you're feeling defensive, if you're feeling some kind of emotional way, if you're feeling like you don't want to stay in the conversation, it's your job actually to keep track, to do the self-examination work, right? To ask God, before God, to search you and figure out what's going on so that you can actually remain in the conversation, because I think these are really important and honoring to God, but we can't do that work if some of us are not committed to staying in the conversation and committed to the journey towards justice and freedom. Next slide. So I particularly get plenty of invitations to have conversations with others around race and racism. I can't always say yes, but I try to, meet with pastors as much as I'm able to. And on one particular occasion, there was a pastor, this is when I was still living in Philly, and there was a pastor who went to the same seminar I went to who reached out and said, "Can we get together?" He was kind of a 30-something pastor, those kind of like white, trendy 20s and 30s millennials kind of flocking to it, kind of growing really fast, one of those kind of churches. And so he wanted to get together, and so it was the middle of a summer. I guess maybe it kind of felt like your fall, but for me, middle of the summer, it was hot, and it was middle of the afternoon, and so we met at this McDonald's. And so I guess this is normal for you, but we enjoy every now and getting the sweet teas. I know that's, you all invented it, I guess, right? But we enjoy up north, some of us enjoy the sweet tea, and like the real sweet, not the sweetened northern tea, but like the real sweet tea where the sugar's like gritting through your teeth and you're like getting cavities, right, as you're drinking. The real sweet tea, your dentist is like shaking at night. He's known you did something wrong, and that kind of sweet tea. So there we are, we're drinking our sweet teas and we're having conversations, just kind of going back and forth, sharing our stories. And partway through, after sharing our stories, my friend, he grabs a cup and he puts it between us and he's like, "Drew, you see this cup? You see what's on your side, there's a logo, and on my side, there's some writings, and I can't see what's on your side of the cup, and you can't see what's on my side of the cup, and so I need your eyes so that I can see what's on your side, and you need my eyes to see what's on my side. And, so we had a nice little kind of PBS moment there. It was really nice what he had to say, really sweet. And then after he was finished, though, I kind of, pushed him on. I said, that's nice, but the world don't actually work like that. And I went on, and I'm sure I probably seemed a little abrasive, but I said, I already know what's on your side of the cup. Then I went on to explain what I meant. I said, look, even when I was in predominantly black schools, I still had predominantly white teachers. I was always learning Eurocentric history. I had to navigate those spaces. When I went off to college, I went to this Christian college where I was the only African-American male on my floor my first year. I had to learn a whole new world and a whole new rhetoric and popular media and all kinds of stuff, right? The very work that I do, whether it be because it's going through the PhD program or just the ongoing work I do in the classroom and vice versa, I have to constantly know what it is to be a black male and have my body being interpreted by a mostly white audience. I'm navigating that all the time. I couldn't do the work I do without having to make sense of that reality. And my pushback from my friend was, because he was also an author, and I said, look, you can go your whole entire life, and had at that point gone his whole entire life, without stepping foot in any black communities, without understanding black history, without reading black intellectual thought, without understanding arts and literature and all kinds of stuff, right? You can go your whole entire world outside of those things, outside of those black institutions and such, and it will not impact you one bit. And so what I wanted to explain is that, it's nice that we have cross-cultural exchange moments where we're sharing and swapping our stories back and forth, but that we have to realize that behind that stands unequal and inequitable power dynamics, right? Historical forces at work that are shaping even our little interactions and conversations. And if we can't be honest about the broader contexts, wide scale, as well as the historical realities that shape our context, then we can feel really good in these little moments and not really be doing much to change the broader patterns that are all around us. And so my challenge, I think, especially in the church, is us moving away from kind of these kind of simplistic answers to very complex problems, right? We love, and there's nothing wrong with them, but we love pulpit swaps and potlucks, and worship services, and all those things are great, and we should keep doing them, but those aren't going to bring down the walls of white supremacy, right? And if we pretend that just those little interactions outside of actually dealing with the systems and structures and institutions in place are actually going to solve the problems, then again, we're bringing simplistic answers to very complex and broad problems. Next slide. So, in my experience, one of the challenges in even dealing with race and talking about race is that constantly we don't always mean the same thing when we're using the same words, right? You ever have a conversation with somebody and you seem like you're talking about the same thing, but it just seems like you're all on different wavelengths, right? That, I think, is often happening when it comes to race and racism, that we are operating out of two contrasting definitions of racism. One definition, I call it the more popular dominant cultural definition of racism, usually just more focused on personal racism, individual racism, the overt hatred or prejudice from one person to another, right? Or an act against because somebody's skin color, right? And oftentimes, to be fair, that's oftentimes in many English dictionaries, that's gonna be your first definition in many English dictionaries. It's gonna be that very narrow, thin definition of what racism is, solely focused on individuals and hearts and intentions, prejudice and hatred from one person to another. But that's not the only definition floating around. There's a whole nother definition where people actually mean something much different. They're talking about systems and structures in place, right? And so the way of talking about that, you'll often find that in the sociology department, all right? For folks that do critical race theory, right? You're gonna have much more robust definitions of race and racism. And so they're tracking the widespread patterns, the institutionalized ways that race is embedded into our societies, the structures, cultures, systems. They're looking at the history of race and how it develops, the function, the work that it does, right? Not just acknowledging it, but why was it needed in the first place, right? What is it doing sociologically and politically? How is it shaping our lives? And so those are very different definitions, a thin one and a very thick one, right? The thin one, in some ways, nobody can know what's going on in somebody else's heart, so it's just guesswork at that point. The thick one, though, defines and names how our society is organized and how we participate in it, and how our identities are formed, and the kind of ways that we interact and navigate this racialized history. And so I think the thick definition actually helps us understand and make sense of the world that we live in, but sometimes we're not always using the same definitions. Again, so I often, when somebody says something is racist, I actually love to ask, what do you mean by that? And ask them to define what they mean by racism. And it's up to us, if you want to challenge the definition or if you want to just use a different term yourself, but I think it's important on our behalf to make sure that we understand that a lot of times we're having different conversations even while we're using the same words. Next slide. Just as a quick example, I'll share, this is my working definition. Don't try to read it all. I'll just real quick read it just to give you a glimpse of a thicker definition of racism. So I say it's racist, and you can notice hopefully you can notice that there's a few bold words there that I think are key to thinking about, at least how I think about what racism does. Racism is a humanly constructed system that socializes people into their racial identities, biases, and practices, and it organizes our society by race, legally or de facto, in a way that structurally justifies advantaging whiteness as a marker for social access and dominance, or at a minimum, people internalize a psychological sense that whiteness marks superiority. Think about like poor white folks that still hold on to white supremacy, right? They're not necessarily dominating others, but they're participating in a sense of superiority. It explicitly and implicitly distorts people's perceptions and social frameworks so that they view white bodies, practices, cultural productions, traditions, and knowledges as normative, universal, superior, and more valuable than non-white ones, right? And so the key words, racism socializes us, it organizes us, it justifies the world as it is, and it distorts the way that we see, right, the world. So that's just an idea of how you can go about thinking about a thicker definition. All right, next slide. So in the 1940s, there was something called the Clark-Doll experiments. And the Clark-Doll experiments, basically what they did at that time is that they would take one child at a time and they would put two sets of dolls in front of them and ask them a series of questions, right? They would say, which one is the good doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the ugly doll? So they had black children and white children responding to these questions, again, back in the 1940s, and nobody really is that surprised necessarily by how many of the white children in the 1940s responded to these questions. Across the board, it was very easy that they had an overwhelming sense in which whiteness, right, marked everything good in the world and everything beautiful in the world, blackness, everything bad and negative. And so people remember these, the Clark-Doll experiments, not because of how the white children responded, but more because they were intrigued by how the black children responded. Of course, in our society today, the big fear that most people talk about is reverse racism, right? Somehow we're going to reverse racism. But it was interesting that what actually happened when they asked these children the same questions, which doll is the good doll, which doll is the bad doll, which doll is the pretty doll, which is the ugly doll, is that the black children had also internalized a racial hierarchy in which, not to the same degree, but also in the same hierarchical framework, that whiteness was good and blackness was bad, right? And so when they're asked which doll is the bad doll, they point to the black doll, many of them. And many of them, when they're asked which doll is the ugly doll, also point to the black doll. And then, after they had given these negative attributes to these two dolls that look the same other than the color of the doll itself, they're asked, which doll looks most like you? And they point to the black doll, right? And you can see the ways in which they had also, as human beings, internalized, not reversed, but had internalized the racial hierarchical system that's embedded in our modern racist framework. And that modern racist framework is, ultimately, then when I use the term racial hierarchy, it's to talk about white supremacy, on one pole and anti-blackness on the other pole, right? Not white people and black people. Sometimes we hear that. That's not actually what I'm trying to say. It's white supremacy and whiteness itself being lifted up as the top of the hierarchical spectrum, and anti-blackness on the other end of that spectrum. And this in real ways affects all communities all around the world, and we can see that in so many cases. I know recently there was a Dove commercial that showed a black woman supposedly getting washed, and she takes off and she becomes white, right? And there's been detergent. There was a commercial from Asia where there was a detergent where a young black man was kind of talking to this Asian woman, and she kind of lures him over, and then he comes and she stuffs him into the machine, throws the detergent in, sits on it, waits for a little bit. He comes out a very pale Asian man, right? Anti-blackness. You think about Haiti, right, and the Dominican Republic and the way that Haitians are treated on that side of the island, right? There's clear anti-blackness, even with white people not even present, right? It's pervasive and we could get into reasons for why it's so pervasive now, why it's a global phenomenon. But white supremacy and anti-blackness are realities that impact all people all around the world in various ways, and that we have to keep track of. Next slide. So there's a book, Divided by Faith. It came out early 21st century, but I think that what was interesting, there were two Christian sociologists looking at particularly the racial divisions in the church itself and how Christians were more divided than the rest of society was the main point. But they did talk quite a bit about a racialized society, and I won't talk about everything that's up there, but the one thing that I thought was particularly helpful was that they argued that you could tell that we live in a racialized society when race matters profoundly for differences in life experiences, life opportunities, and social relationships, right? That those are some of the ways that you can notice. And certainly, if you track life experiences, life opportunities, and social relationships, you can see that it's clearly racialized in our worlds, and one of just the ways of measuring whether we live in a racialized society or not. But I think, next slide, it can be hard sometimes for us to think about how racialized our society is, because sometimes we have such individualistic ways of thinking about it and looking at it. And I don't know if many of you guys remember when Paula Deen went on, she got exposed basically, right, a few years ago she wanted to have like a plantation wedding with black people serving. She got caught having said the N-word and all kinds of stuff, right? And it was really ugly. And one of the things I remember about that particular moment in time was the way that it was actually pretty broad. That everybody was kind of like, yo, bad Paula Deen, right? Like, this was unacceptable. She was getting blasted like everywhere, all over, on every TV station. Everybody in unison were like giving her the wag, right? Bad Paula Deen. This was disgusting. This was really terrible. And I thought about it, initially I kind of wanted to jump into, because I was like, yeah, that was really, who would think of this kind of stuff? It was really terrible. And then all of a sudden, I stepped back and I was like, wait a minute, something just doesn't seem right. Like, how is it that everybody is scapegoating and scolding Paula Deen in this moment, right? Everybody. How is it so easy for all Americans to scold Paula Deen? And so I figured there was something a little off about this if it was so easy for everybody to do it. And so what I thought about was that, Paula Deen, she didn't drop down from a vacuum somewhere, right? Like, Paula Deen was socialized, right? Paula Deen was not like some evil scientist who went into a lab somewhere and concocted racism and then gave it to us, right? She's not that slick. She was socialized by communities, by people in her family and institutions and churches or wherever she was a part of. And so if you want to understand the things that Paula Deen said, all you got to do is read U.S. history, and it makes a lot of sense where it came from, right? And it didn't start with Paula Deen. She's a byproduct of being socialized in our racialized society, right? Where there's these larger patterns of racism and this 400 years of inertia of history are in play. And what my problem with the scolding of Paula Deen by everybody was, it made everybody kind of seem like like, yeah, we've isolated the bad racist, right? We've isolated the bad racist, and us good people now can kind of go back to just doing our work, and it doesn't really hold anybody accountable systemically and socially across the board for all these realities that she did not create, but just caught, right? I say her biggest crime was that she got caught with the outdated racism rather than updating to the 21st century racism, right? She didn't get the 2.0 update. But the reality is that she's just as much a part of society as all of us are. And so the greater challenge is to think about how are we navigating our racialized society? How are we being faithful in response to the history that precedes us, to the inertia of white supremacy that precedes us? Much easier to scapegoat an individual and try to make them seem like the bad racists. But if it's not that easy, if it's not just about bad racists and us good people, but that we're all participants, and we got to think about, are we perpetuating the racism? Are we complicit in it? Are we silent to it, right? Or are we resisting it daily? I think those are the kind of questions that we need to be asking, which might lead us to different ways of responding to these kind of more overt moments. Next slide. Along with that, I think that since the civil rights movement, we've seen a huge shift going on in terms of how people talk and respond to racism. And one of the things that has become very popular post-civil rights in the white community is colorblind rhetoric. Now, colorblind rhetoric was, it wasn't really colorblind rhetoric, but the language actually initiated in the black community where black people would say things that affirmed that we're all created in the image of God, that we're one human race, and that didn't bind us, and so we need to be able to see other people's shared humanity, right? You could see that all the way back to like Richard Allen says really key things like that, going back to the Acts verse that talks about Adam being the start of all of the human race. But what happened post-civil rights is that language got used and it got flipped on its head. It got inverted. So now that language, instead of using language to humanize and also then do the work of racial justice and equality, instead it gets used to actually not have conversations on race. So people will say, I don't know what you're talking, I'm colorblind, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't see race. I'm like, really? You don't even know that I'm a black man standing here? You just don't see race. I mean, if someone is like literally colorblind, then that's fine. I understand that. That's great. But otherwise, of course you see race, right? And really, it just shuts down conversations. And it's hard to take someone seriously when they say that they don't see race, that they don't see color. Now, I guess the question, of course, the quick comment would be is that, of course, there's nothing wrong with the diversity of God's creation, right? And the diversity can be celebrated and enjoyed. There's nothing to be avoiding in that sense. But on a deeper level, it's interesting that many sociologists have noted that the folks who sometimes are most adamant about how colorblind they are, in fact, live some of the most racialized lives, right? And so there's this kind of deep contradiction often, right? This deep kind of almost defensive posture that I'm colorblind and at the same time living extremely racialized lives. And so you can have like a white person say, I'm colorblind, and they have all white friends, go to all white church, live in an all white neighborhood, send their kids to all white schools, go shopping at stores where only white people shop, down to the little nitty gritty of in their homes, right? Who's around their dinner table, who they call up on the phone, or even what books are on their bookshelf, right? And all of a sudden, when they start analyzing carefully, it's very racially distinct. Right? Their lives are very racially distinct. And it's not necessarily that they intended to necessarily live a racially distinct life, but they went on with the inertia of the currents of our society, and now they live very racially distinct lives. And so the colorblind racism then is actually preventing people from actually, even if they're saying it in good intentions, right? Preventing people from actually seeing the truth of where they're at and thinking about what they need to do moving forward, right? And so not only is it dishonoring to the diversity that exists, but it's not even helping someone do the self-examination work that's necessary, especially as Christians, if we're going to be responding to the racialized history that we have in our country. Next slide. in our society, you know, I won't get into the analogy that I use in terms of in the book. I talk about a race card and racialized deck, just the ways that we focus on the individual situations rather than the broad patterns that are going on and the historic patterns that are going on. But I will say this. There were a few university studies done. One university study actually looked at how how names on resumes are received and responded to in employment processes, right? And so they actually doctored and made up fake resumes and sent them out to people. And what they did was they put on some of them what would be called traditionally white-sounding names on some resumes and traditionally black-sounding names on some other resumes, right? So that there would be a racial association along with the resume, even though the people weren't actually being seen. Otherwise, all the criteria of the resumes were being controlled completely, right? Top-notch resumes otherwise. And nonetheless, still, white resumes were getting received and accepted at higher rates than the black ones, right? That's a superficial one. There was another study that looked, another university study, and this time what they did was they actually sent out actors, and they wanted to test the initial stage of the employment process and to think about how race and criminality impact people's livelihood in terms of having opportunities to get employment. And so they sent people out the initial stage. They're looking for a success or positive interactions, right? And so that could mean anything from getting hired, getting a call back to getting hired on the spot in the initial stage of the employment process. So they sent out white men and black men. The white men had a 35% positive response. All right, so you can kind of get a base. White men without any conviction had a 35% positive response in the employment process. White men with a conviction had a 17% positive response. And so you can already tell, like, really how seriously a stigma criminality is in our society, right? We don't let people let go of even if after they've served time, that reality still haunts them ongoing. And so it cuts in half white men's likelihood of finding employment, even in the early stage of the employment process, very clearly. Black men without a conviction had a 14% positive response. And I think some of y'all missed it. White men, right? White men with a conviction had a 17% positive response. Black men without a conviction had a 14% positive response. They're actually faring worse in the employment process than those white men who actually had a conviction. And then black men with a conviction had a 5% positive response, right? And again, that's not 5% hired, that's 5% at least making it through the initial stage of the process. And so again, these are just kind of some of the ways that people can actually test and measure that race is impacting black people's lives across the board in their daily experiences. Next slide. I wanted us to think a little bit about, I know you guys have been thinking about the education system and racial inequalities in our education systems. In Pennsylvania, we're dealing with some stuff because Pennsylvania is like one of the, I think we might be the only state, I'm not sure, but if not the only, one of the few that don't have in place a fair funding formula for the state funds that get distributed throughout the state. And so what that has meant is that there's just a completely racist way in which funds are being distributed in Pennsylvania. And it's actually been statisticians and mathematicians have done the work and made it clear, demonstrated how racist Pennsylvania's distribution of funds are. And we've had some minor wins in the last couple of years. We got them to create a fair funding formula, and they boosted the budget by 6% and put that 6% through and left the remainder in place, which seems more like an admission of guilt than it is of actually trying to fix the problem. And so we've been gathering together and kind of organizing faith leaders throughout Pennsylvania, led by, we have a PICO group called Power Interfaith in Philadelphia that's excellent. And then there's also a group that I'm working with in Harrisburg called Free Together. And between those two, we're doing some really good organizing around education and the racial inequalities that exist, particularly around funding, state funding in our education system. But funding, of course, is one of those areas that are almost always, no matter if there is a fair funding formula or whatever, usually you're going to find some overt racial disparities if you look close enough. I'm sure I'm not an expert on South Carolina, what's going on. You guys are the experts. But I'm sure that there is some overt racial disparities there in terms of funding that need to be addressed. So that's one area, right, that I think needs to certainly be thought about and something that can be organized around. Another one is discipline in the school systems, right? It's been documented over and over and over again that black children, black boys and girls are both being over-disciplined, right? That there's an extreme bias against black children. And so if a white girl and a black girl talk in class, and then they're told a second time to be quiet, right? The kind of punishment that will be handed out will be much more extreme for that young black woman than it will be for the white woman, right? And so there's extreme disparities in terms of discipline. There's these biases that people believe that we have to come down hard on young black children, and the end result is enormous amounts of school suspensions and sometimes being kicked out of school. And those things haunt people for the rest of their lives. They're great predictors for folks who will end up not going to college, but certainly getting caught up in the prison system, right? And so there's a school to prison pipeline that exists, and a lot of it is around even how discipline is being carried out in our schools and very little intervention. And I think certainly there's easy opportunity for the church to have conversations around restorative practices, right? There's certainly some really good Christian thinkers who've done some good work around restorative practices and thinking about how we can influence how the school does discipline in the school system ought to be forefront of what we're trying to do. And so that's another area that I think certainly needs to be focused on. And then the third one, which I've kind of already mentioned as I even talked about my own experience, which is curriculum, right? That at the heart of the public education systems are white-centered narratives, right? White heroes and white figures that center white people's experiences, and that sense diminish, ignore, and downplay the significance and contributions of black people and other people of color in our society today, right? And so that is basically, it's another way of practicing white supremacy. That's what I mean when I talk about white supremacy. Is not just those overt things, right? It's the ways that it gets embedded into everyday life and normalizes whiteness and white supremacy and superiority. And so I think funding, discipline, and curriculum are certainly key things. Those are not the only things, but I think those are central things that I think the church certainly should be having a voice into and organizing around. But I say all that, and then I also have to also acknowledge, this all happens in the broader context of communities that have been plundered and exploited for years, right, for generations. Communities that don't have access to resource and opportunities that other communities can take for granted. And so often when you're seeing disparities in terms of outcomes of education and grade levels and things like that, just fixing even funding, discipline, and curriculum will not fix everything, because it's a part of a larger problems, right? If we don't address the poverty that the schools inhabit, the communities are impoverished in the systems and structures and lack of access to resources and opportunities, these things will feed into each other. You will struggle to focus in class if your community is struggling economically, if it's exploited, if there's high levels of unemployment, if there's high levels of violence, right? All these things are going to impact the other and vice versa, right? And so education will impact the community in terms of other issues that are going on, but those larger systemic issues of unjust realities need to be addressed also if we really thoroughly want to address what's going on in our community. So I just say that we can't lose track and think that we're just going to fix this and everything else will fall into place. They're always interwebbed and intertied together. And I think as Christian leaders, again, we can't have superficial answers, right, to really complex problems. We have to realize that there won't be any quick, easy fixes. Even any of those individual things are not easy fixes. But even working on those, to just be honest and realistic, that this is some serious work ahead of us. Thankfully, we say that we serve an almighty God that is able, right? And so we can trust in God that he is working with us, but also to recognize then that we need to throw ourselves sometimes at the grace of God and say, this is larger than us. And there is going to be no white saviors flying in to fix these problems, but it's going to take a collective, long-term perseverance to do the work. Next slide. So I wanted us to just really briefly think about Romans 12, 1 and 2. This is the New English translation. It says, Therefore I exhort you, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a sacrifice, alive, holy, and pleasing to God, which is your reasonable service. Do not be conformed to this present world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may test and approve what is the will of God, what is good and well-pleasing and perfect. And I think what is particularly helpful about this passage as it relates to thinking about our racialized society and these historic injustices, white supremacy, anti-blackness, all these things that shape how we view others and how we're viewed in the world, is that first we're asked to present our bodies, right, as sacrifices, as living sacrifices. And I think that's important in the sense that, so here it acknowledges that there's patterns that we don't need to be conformed to, but we're to present our bodies, right? That what we actually do with our bodies actually matters. That can be missed, right? That what we actually do with our bodies actually matters. Our actual embodiment, our presence, right? When we decide to gather, and who shows up, and if your body is there in the building, and if it isn't, right? That actually matters, right? Whose body you put your bodies alongside of matters, right? When there's organizing to be done in your local communities, where's your body, right? Do you present it as a living sacrifice? Does your body show up? That actually what we do with our bodies actually matters. And I think that, sometimes we can, the saying is we're so spiritually minded, right, that we don't have any good to offer our communities and the people, our neighbors, right? Here's a great opportunity for us to actually show up and to place our bodies and to not allow our bodies to be patterned, right? I talked about some people sometimes living racially distinct lives and not even realizing it, right? What does it mean to live intentionally and thoughtfully about how your daily embodiment and where your body is and where it's placed alongside of and who's it's in solidarity with, who you're linking your body in arms with and who you're not, right? Those things actually matter, and we need to actually take them very seriously. And then the second part is maybe more straightforward, but that we would have our minds renewed, right? That race is just as much about ways of thinking and seeing the world, framing the world, right? Viewing others and being viewed in the world. It justifies the world as it is, right? So if you walk around and just think everything is normal and nothing is wrong, that means it's done its work, right? We need renewed minds that can actually see and be troubled and disturbed by the racialized world that we live in, by the white supremacy, by the anti-blackness, by the xenophobia, by all these things that are going on in our communities. We ought to be troubled by them, and it will take some renewed minds that are able to once again recognize what God desires for God's creation, right? And so I think that there's a great opportunity for us to both present our bodies as sacrifices and also to have renewed minds in the midst of the racialized patterns that exist in our society around us. I want to close this section with a story, then we're going to enter into some conversation together. But I live in Harrisburg now, but this is the second time living in Harrisburg. The first time I was a youth pastor, and I worked at an after-school program immediately after I graduated college. And the neighborhood that I live in is called Allison Hill. It's a mostly poor Black and Latino community. And for the most part, on the outskirts, there's some white folks, but in general, like most of Allison Hill, there's not a lot of white folks that live in Allison Hill. And so that, it's strange sometimes to see a lot of white folk, right? So anyway, one particular day, I hopped into my 92 Mercury Sable as my first car I ever had, and I was driving through the hill and just kind of down Market Street, which is like the main artery of Allison Hill. And as you approach 15th, 14th Street, literally, there usually are hardly, the only white people there are the really poor, impoverished white people that got left behind in white flight, because Allison Hill, decades ago, was actually a white neighborhood. So, those are the only white people you will ever see. Well, this particular day, I'm driving, and there's a lot of white people out. I mean, there are a lot of white people out, and I'm kind of confused and intrigued by the fact that there's so many white people there. And so I'm driving, and I'm trying to figure out what's going on, and I notice that they all got these bright yellow t-shirts on, right? So they're very visible. They want to be seen, and I'm seeing them. And I'm like, okay, that's kind of interesting. And so I noticed that they're like handing these grocery bags out to everybody as they're walking down the sidewalk. It didn't seem, at least as far as I could tell, it just seemed like they're just giving out to anybody. I almost pulled over to get my own free bag because it seemed like there was no method to the madness. You know, like Oprah, like you get a bag, everybody gets a bag. And so there I am, I'm kind of, but I'm late, so I can't stop and get a bag. And so I keep driving. And, you know, again, all this time I'm just thinking, probably just silly Christian folks. We don't know how to use our resources well. We're not thinking through systematically how to distribute resources, right? But then I get closer and I see what was on the T-shirt, and then it said Harrisburg Invasion. And then I didn't think it was funny anymore. Harrisburg Invasion. These folks came together, organized, and their plan was that they were going to invade our community, that we were just apparently poor black and brown folk just waiting around, sitting, twiddling our thumbs, waiting to be saved, right? I mean, I know, of all people, I know that many folks sometimes can have a white savior complex, but you don't usually put it as like the motto of the event. And so, you know, I was really troubled and bothered by the fact that they actually, like, that was okayed, right? Somebody rubber stamped that as, like, that's going to be our motto. We're going to be invading this community, do our drive-by ministry, hand out our bags, and be gone. And I think about, like, what might have happened, right, had these folks, because, I mean, Allison Hills actually got amazing leaders. I mean, just amazing folks on the ground doing all kinds of stuff in our community. And I imagine what might have happened had these folks called them up on the phone and said, look, we got all these resources and we're willing to partner with you. You know, what do you suggest? And maybe they might have said, you know, hold your money. We actually don't even need your money. Maybe they wouldn't have said that, but I imagine that they might have said, you know what, why don't you show up and do some mentoring or teach some, you know, computer classes or whatever, right? Who knows what they could have came, but there could have been an opportunity where they actually entered and came under the existing leadership that already existed in that community and followed them and actually done something much more meaningful and sustainable in the long term than that one-time ministry. Now, granted, like, I step back and I wonder, maybe I'm too hard on these folks. These were good-intentioned people, right? I mean, they had really good hearts. I'm confident that they had really good intentions when they came out, and so I don't even guess. I'm not second-guessing their intentions at all. I imagine that they were very well-intentioned folks. So I think, am I being too hard? I mean, this is not the 1800s. They're not coming in here. They're not enslaving people. This is not 1932 or something. They're not setting up a Jim Crow system or sharecropping or convict leasing or any of that kind of stuff, right? They literally are coming out trying to do good and trying to help, right? But I guess when I think about all of that, I guess the problem is that even as there are certainly some changes that have taken place, right, that racial hierarchy still stayed in its place, right? The sense of superiority still remained intact. Good intentions or not, racial hierarchy still was present in those interactions and shaped the kind of character and nature of those interactions. And I think that fundamentally needs to be addressed, right? And so I think if we're going to be serious about confronting racism in any sphere, right, including the public education system, we have to be committed first as Christians to getting to the root of it, right? Not just being well-intentioned, but getting to the root that we actually dismantle white supremacy itself. And until the racial hierarchy is flattened, there will continue to be, even with well-intentioned folks, these really terrible moments in which people cannot come as human beings, shared human beings, and in which people who maybe ought to be followers, you know, some folks who are used to leading all the time sometimes need to learn how to be followers, right? And those who maybe are inclined to want to just follow maybe need to step up and be the ones leading the conversation because they maybe have more insight into what's actually going on around us. Jesus himself would say all the time, the first are last and the last are first, right? Flipping the social expectations on their head. And so I think that that is certainly required for us if we're going to be serious. So let's have some conversation. And there's some questions I want you to think about. Next slide here. around your tables, 3 questions. How does a thicker framework for understanding racism make it easier and or harder for your local churches to undo and resist it? 2, what are some doable approaches your churches can take to challenge racial injustice locally and regionally? And 3, what kind of faith-rooted organizing is happening already around education inequities in South Carolina? How can you join and deepen these efforts? Those are just some starting points for conversations, and I'm going to hand it over for a little bit.
I'm Andrew Waldo, Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Upper South Carolina, and we have 3 15-minute table discussion times. And I would say if you're at a table with a lot of people and there's a table near you with a smaller number, just spread it out a little bit so that the time will be evenly divided and everybody gets a voice. I think it's very important. If you take the number of people at your table and divide the amount of time we have by that number of people, then that gives you a sense of how much time, more or less, each person gets to speak. And we want to just be sure, monitor yourselves that each person at the table at least has an opportunity to say something. In work that we have done in Upper South Carolina, in conversation, we've certainly found it helpful to us to get at some of the deeper, more systemic issues, to use I and we language instead of you or they language as we talk. I will be the timekeeper. I'll give you a couple of minute warning before we go and before we reconvene for the next piece of it. So 15 minutes from now.